The morning light filtered through the broken roof of the Stuttgart salvage yard, painting streaks of pale gold across mountains of twisted steel. Karl Weiss stood silent among the wrecks, his breath misting in the cool air, eyes tracing the rusted curve of an American Sherman tank that sat like a sleeping beast. Its hull was dented, its tracks half buried in mud, yet something about its stance spoke of endurance, not defeat. It had once designed machines that were worshipped for precision and power, tigers that roared across Europe, but they had fallen like monuments built on arrogance. Captain Mallory approached, coat unbuttoned, cigarette in hand, the casual confidence of a man who had survived too much to be impressed by legends. "You're the engineer, huh?" he asked. Karl nodded, his English measured. "I was," he replied. Mallory gestured to the Sherman. "Then let's see what you make of our ugly duckling." As Karl placed his hand on the metal, he felt warmth still in it, like memory refusing to cool. The clatter of tools broke the stillness as Karl and Mallory worked beneath the gray shell of the Sherman. The American officer watched the German methodically loosen bolts with slow precision, his movements too careful, too deliberate, as though dissecting a rival. "You treat it like a museum piece," Mallory remarked. Karl didn't look up. "Machines deserve respect," he said quietly. "Even foreign ones." The words surprised them both. Hal Dunn, the young sergeant assigned to assist, chuckled from behind the engine bay. "Back home, we just hit it until it worked," he said, grinning. Karl's brow furrowed, but his curiosity flickered. When they pried open the transmission cover, the engineer froze. The gears were simple, almost crude, yet somehow flawless. Every piece fit with forgiving tolerance, built not for brilliance, but for survival. "It shouldn't work this well," Karl muttered, and Mallory, wiping his hands, answered softly, "That's kind of the point." By afternoon, Karl had dismantled half the engine, each part laid out in perfect lines across the dirt floor. His instincts wanted to critique. The machining was rough, the tolerances wide, but his mind kept circling the same truth. Every imperfection had purpose. The Sherman wasn't a masterpiece. It was a survivor. Hal whistled low. "Ain't pretty, huh? But she'll still run after hell freezes." Karl gave him a look that wasn't quite annoyance. "It was not designed to impress," he murmured. "Only to endure." Mallory crouched beside him, studying the rows of components. "You Germans built for engineers," he said. "We built for farmers." Karl considered that, and for the first time he smiled, a small, reluctant curve of respect. Night descended quietly, the last echoes of work fading into the rustling wind. The three men sat by the open hull, a lantern between them, the tank's silhouette looming like an old god of war. Hal told stories of mud and breakdowns in France, laughing at memories too heavy for humor. Mallory listened in silence, his eyes lost in the flame. Karl studied the worn steel before him, the faint hum of wind through its cavities. "In my country," he said softly, "we built to dominate. You built to return home." Mallory looked up, meeting his gaze through the lantern's glow. "That's the difference, Karl. You built to win wars. We built so boys could live through them." The words settled like dust on cold metal, unanswerable and true. When dawn broke again, frost glazed the tank's surface. Karl returned early before the Americans stirred. He stood alone beside the Sherman, his breath visible in the cold eyes tracing the lines of its design. It had been built without vanity, simple, strong, almost humble. He placed his hand on the armor again, feeling the cold press of steel that had carried men through infernos. For the first time, he didn't see an enemy's creation. He saw a purpose forged through necessity. Behind him, Mallory's voice broke the quiet. "You like her now?" Karl hesitated, then nodded once. "She reminds me of something we forgot," he said. Mallory smiled faintly. "What's that?" Karl answered. "That war is not for proving who builds best, But who endures longest? Days turned into weeks, and the salvage yard became Carl's confessional. Every morning, he returned to the Sherman like a pilgrim to a relic, its open hull revealing truths he'd once ignored. He kept notes, sketches, quiet observations of American design choices that baffled and humbled him. Yet at night, when he walked through the crumbled streets toward home, the silence pressed harder than the metal ever did. Clara waited by the window, a candle burning low beside her sewing. She asked no questions, though her eyes carried them all. "You spend your days with their machines," she said one evening, her voice soft but edged with fatigue. Carl removed his gloves, staring at the oil stains that wouldn't wash off. "I'm trying to understand what they built," he answered, "and what we lost trying to build better." The next morning, frost lay thick over the yard. Mallory handed Carl a clipboard of reports but didn't speak. Words had become unnecessary between them. Mutual respect had taken their place. Hal arrived late, carrying a tin of coffee that tasted like burnt hope. "Your wife ever get tired of the smell?" he asked, laughing as he poured some into Carl's cup. "She smells worse things," Carl said with a faint smile. They laughed, three men caught between yesterday's war and tomorrow's peace. But when Carl opened the Sherman's turret and saw the gunner's position, crude, cramped, functional, his breath caught. "They built this for men to survive, not to show genius," he murmured. For the first time he felt shame, not as defeat, but as awakening. That evening, Carl brought Clara to the yard for the first time. She walked slowly among the wrecks, her breath catching at the sight of metal giants lying broken in the mud. "These once terrified us," she whispered. Carl nodded. "Now they teach me." She reached out to touch the Sherman's armor, the coldness shocking against her skin. "You spend your days with the ghosts of war," she said. "Doesn't it hurt?" Carl's answer was quiet, almost reverent. "It does. But I think understanding is the only way to bury them." She looked at him, seeing for the first time a man not lost in defeat, but rediscovering humility. The wind carried the scent of oil and thawing earth, like the world itself was beginning to forgive. Later that week, Mallory caught Carl sketching again, this time not blueprints, but the face of the Sherman itself, the rounded edges, the simple welds, the human logic in its form. "You're in love with her now," Mallory teased. Carl chuckled softly. "I'm beginning to see her heart." Hal grinned from behind a crate. "Don't tell my Jeep you're cheating on her." Laughter broke the heaviness that had hung between them for days. Yet, beneath it, Carl's thoughts ran deeper. He realized that the war had been fought not only with weapons, but with ideologies of creation. Each nation trying to prove its soul through steel. And maybe, just maybe, the Americans had built theirs closer to mercy. That night, Carl lay awake beside Clara, the distant hum of the foundry echoing through cracked walls. His fingers traced invisible lines on the blanket, patterns of gears, welds, ideas that once defined his worth. "What are you thinking?" Clara murmured in the dark. "That I built things that failed because I built them for pride," he whispered. "They built theirs for men." She turned toward him, resting a hand against his chest. "Then learn from them, Carl. Build again, but this time for life." He closed his eyes, the ghostly echo of engines fading into silence. The war had ended months ago, but for him, its lessons were only beginning. The rain came hard over Stuttgart that morning, a cold, relentless downpour that turned the yard to rivers of mud. Carl worked beneath a canvas tarp, sleeves soaked, glasses streaked with water as he reassembled the Sherman's gearbox. Mallory and Hal watched from the shed, silent but curious. Every movement Carl made carried urgency, not just precision. When he finally slid the last gear into place, he exhaled like a man surfacing from deep water. "It's not beautiful," he said, voice trembling, But it's alive. Mallory stepped closer, his tone gentler than usual. Beauty doesn't win wars, Carl. Men who come home do. The words lingered, mixing with the sound of rain striking metal, until Carl nodded, just once, like a soldier surrendering to truth. That night, Carl couldn't sleep. In the flicker of candlelight, his sketches spread across the table like battlefield maps. He saw the contrast in every line, the simplicity of the Sherman beside the elegance of the Tiger. He remembered the arrogance of design meetings, the laughter of officers demanding perfection over practicality. The images came like accusations, the proud speeches, the blueprints for machines that died in mud, the men who never returned because their tanks had failed them. Clara found him there, hands shaking over the paper. "Carl," she whispered, "you're still fighting." He looked up slowly, eyes hollow. "No," he said, "I'm listening to the dead." The next day, Carl arrived early at the yard, alone. The others hadn't come yet, and silence stretched wide beneath the overcast sky. He climbed into the Sherman's driver's seat, the worn leather cold beneath his hands. He ran his fingers along the control levers, the pedals, everything designed for instinct, not intellect. Closing his eyes, he imagined the man who once sat here, a 19-year-old from Iowa or Kansas, terrified but trusting this machine to carry him through fire. Carl gripped the steering bar and whispered something only the steel could hear. "You carried them home." The wind swept through the open hatch, scattering raindrops over his sketches, and notes like blessings from a forgotten god. By afternoon, Hal and Mallory found him there, still inside the tank, silent as a priest in a confessional. "You planning to drive it?" Hal joked, trying to break the stillness. Carl didn't smile. "I wanted to feel what they felt." Mallory climbed up beside him, eyes softening. "We all did things we thought were right," he said. "But this war, it was a test of who could keep going when right stopped mattering." Carl met his gaze. "And who built for them to survive that test?" he added quietly. The two men sat in wordless understanding, rain tapping gently on steel above their heads, two builders finally united by the same truth. That evening the rain ceased, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight broke through the clouds. Carl stepped outside the yard, hands black with grease, coat heavy with the scent of oil and smoke. In the fading light, the Sherman gleamed faintly, scarred, battered, unbowed. Mallory stood beside him, offering a cigarette without a word. They smoked in silence as the sky turned amber. "You ever think," Carl said slowly, "that the machine a man builds is a reflection of his soul?" Mallory exhaled, watching the smoke drift upward. "Maybe," he said, "but only if he's willing to see it." Carl nodded, eyes fixed on the tank. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a machine. He was looking at a mirror. The air was heavy with smoke and thawing earth when the Allied Review Commission arrived. Carl stood before them beside the Sherman, his notes clutched like confessions. Mallory translated, his voice calm but clipped, as Carl explained the tank's design, its balance between simplicity and strength, its ease of repair. The officers nodded politely, disinterested in philosophy. But Carl's tone shifted. His words carried something raw. "We built machines that demanded perfection," he said, voice trembling. "You built ones that forgave mistakes." The room fell quiet. One officer asked why that mattered. Carl met his gaze. "Because men are imperfect," he answered. "And they deserve machines that understand that." Mallory looked at him then, not as an overseer, but as an equal. After the inspection, Carl sat on the steps outside, the cold biting through his gloves. Mallory joined him, offering a flask. "You did good in there," he said. Carl took a sip, grimacing. "I didn't do good before." The American stayed silent, knowing better than to interrupt confession. "I once signed off on a prototype that burned inside a factory," Carl continued, voice hollow. "2 men died. They said it was for the fatherland. I told myself it was progress. Mallory looked away, eyes darkening. We all told ourselves things to sleep at night. Carl nodded slowly, the frost on his breath catching the faint light. And did you? He asked. Mallory exhaled, gaze fixed on the horizon. Not yet. That night, Carl returned home later than usual. Clara was waiting with a single lamp lit. You spoke today, didn't you? She asked. He nodded. They listened, he said. Then after a pause, and I remembered. She poured him tea, her hands trembling slightly. It's good to remember, she whispered. It means you're still human. Carl stared into the steam rising from the cup. Human, he repeated softly, as if testing the word. The world outside was silent, the ruins blanketed in snow. For the first time, he realized the war had not taken everything. It had left behind the chance to feel again, even through guilt. The next morning, the Allied officers departed, leaving the Sherman for dismantling. Mallory handed Carl a set of wrenches. Last time we opened her up, he said quietly. Carl hesitated, staring at the tank's weathered surface. She deserves better than the scrap heap. Maybe, Mallory said, but every machine ends that way. As they began loosening bolts, the sound of metal against metal echoed across the yard, a rhythm of farewell. When the transmission came free, Carl paused, his hands trembling slightly. It's strange, he murmured, how the things that survive war are the ones that weren't built to last forever. Mallory looked at him, seeing the truth not as irony, but poetry. That evening, Carl returned alone to the yard. The Sherman sat stripped bare, its armor piled in neat rows like gravestones. He walked slowly around it, hand brushing the exposed frame. You were never our enemy, he whispered. You were our lesson. The wind stirred dust across the floor as he placed his notebook on the empty driver's seat. Inside it, the sketches told the story of two philosophies, perfection versus forgiveness, and the bridge between them. As he stepped back, the last light of sunset fell through the broken roof, bathing the tank's remains in gold. It looked, for a fleeting moment, alive again. Spring crept quietly over Stuttgart, thawing the frost and the silence. The salvage yard no longer smelled of smoke, but of wet earth and machine oil. Carl stood beside the remnants of the Sherman, now disassembled to its bones. He wasn't dismantling anymore. He was rebuilding. Not the tank, but an idea. He gathered parts discarded from German wrecks and American hulks alike, sketching designs that married both worlds. Mallory approached, holding orders in one hand. They're sending me home, he said. Carl looked up, nodding. Then you'll take her spirit with you, he replied, tapping the Sherman's frame. Mallory smiled faintly. And you'll keep building yours. They shook hands. Two men once divided by war, now bound by respect, forged in iron. Hal was the last to leave. He loaded tools into a truck, pausing beside Carl. Never thought I'd see a German fix an American tank just for the art of it, he joked. Carl smiled. A real one this time. Art, he said softly. Maybe that's what machines should have been all along. Hal's grin faded to something warmer. You're all right, old man. They shook hands, grease and all. The engine roared to life, coughing dust into the morning air. Carl watched the truck disappear down the road, feeling a strange ache. The kind that comes not from loss, but from being left alive when others aren't. The yard fell silent again, save for the steady rhythm of his heart and the ticking of cooling metal. Days passed in silence, but Carl no longer feared it. He welded late into the night, shaping something new from the Sherman's spare parts. A small plow rig for clearing debris from ruined streets. Clara watched from the doorway, her eyes shining softly in the flickering torchlight. You're building again, she said. Yes, he answered, pausing to lift his goggles. For the living this time. The machine was crude but strong, built not to destroy, but to heal. When it moved for the first time, its engine sputtering to life, Carl felt tears sting his eyes. He didn't wipe them away. Some machines, he thought, were meant to run on forgiveness. Word spread through the nearby villages. The German engineer who once built tanks now repaired farm tools. Men came with broken engines, women with rusted bicycles, children who stared wide-eyed at the foreign machines reborn under his hands. Carl taught them how to mend what war had broken. At night, he returned home with grease under his nails and hope in his chest. Clara would wait at the window, candlelight dancing in her eyes. "You smell of oil again." She'd tease gently. "Then I must be alive again," he'd answer, smiling. The world outside was still scarred, but each repaired tool, each engine that rumbled back to life, was a heartbeat of peace. One evening, Carl walked back to the yard alone. The Sherman skeleton still stood, half buried in weeds, silent and proud. He ran a hand along its worn surface, feeling warmth from the day's sun still clinging to the metal. "You taught me," he whispered, "that strength isn't in perfection but in endurance." The wind stirred through the yard, carrying the scent of oil and grass. In the distance, the foundries burned again, not for war, but for rebuilding. Carl turned toward home, hands black with work and heart lighter than it had been in years. Behind him, the last light of dusk caught the Sherman's frame, and for a moment it seemed to glow, alive once more, in peace. By summer, the sound of engines once again echoed across the valleys. Not tanks, but tractors. Carl's design, simple and strong, had found its way beyond Stuttgart. Farmers wrote to thank him. Soldiers returned from captivity, seeking his help to rebuild their machines for fields instead of battlefields. He no longer felt pride in the way he once had. This was something purer. At the local workshop, a boy no older than 14 asked him, "Did you build tanks once?" Carl paused, then smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "but now I build hope." The boy grinned, and together they bent over the worn steel of an engine reborn from wreckage, sunlight glinting off the tools that once belonged to war. Letters came from across Germany, farmers, mechanics, even former soldiers, asking for blueprints of the plow Carl had built. Clara organized them neatly on their table, smiling as she read the names aloud. "They call it the WWII," she said teasingly. Carl chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Then they've misunderstood. It was never mine to name. It belonged to everyone who chose to live after war." Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then let it be theirs," she whispered. Outside, children ran past the window, their laughter spilling through the open door. For the first time, Carl realized the world no longer sounded like metal. It sounded like life. One morning, a familiar figure arrived at the yard. Mallory, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, his posture relaxed but eyes unchanged. "I had to see it," he said, gesturing to the rebuilt workshop. Carl clasped his hand, surprised and grateful. They walked together among machines built from the skeletons of tanks, silent witnesses transformed into tools of peace. "You kept building," Mallory said. Carl smiled. "You told me to." They paused before the old Sherman frame, now surrounded by vines and flowers. "Strange," Mallory said quietly. "Back home, I've put one of these in a museum." Carl nodded. "Here, we buried ours in soil." For a moment, the silence between them felt holy. As evening fell, Carl and Mallory shared one last drink beneath the canopy of the yard. "You ever think about going back?" Mallory asked. Carl shook his head. "Everything I needed to learn was here." Mallory stared at the Sherman's ghostly outline, then laughed softly. "You know, for years we thought you Germans built machines without hearts." Carl looked at him with a calm certainty. "We did, until we lost everything that made us human. Then we started again." They raised their glasses in quiet salute, not to victory or loss, but to endurance. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind only the hum of a world mending itself. Long after Mallory left, The village continued to hum with quiet industry. Carl watched from his doorway as young men worked in the yard, repairing engines, shaping steel, building the future. He felt no need to lead, only to guide, gently, like a teacher passing on the last of his lessons. Clara joined him, resting her hand on his arm. "You gave them something they can build on," she said. Carl smiled faintly, eyes on the smoke rising from chimneys across the valley. "No," he whispered. "We gave them something they won't have to rebuild again." As the evening bells tolled in the distance, Carl closed his eyes. The sound was not of war, not of loss, but of a world finally remembering how to breathe. Years passed, and the workshop no longer smelled of ash, but of wood and iron and life. Carl's hair had turned white, his hands slower, but still steady. The Weiss rig had spread across the countryside, pulling plows instead of cannons, feeding a generation that had never seen war. Visitors came often, young engineers who called him teacher, though he never claimed the title. One afternoon, as he adjusted the gears on an old plow, a student asked, "How did you learn to build like this?" Carl smiled faintly, wiping his hands on a rag. "By taking apart something that should never have worked," he said, "and finding out why it did." The boy didn't understand then, but someday he would. That evening, Carl sat with Clara by the window overlooking the fields. The wheat swayed like a sea of gold beneath the setting sun. Clara's hair had turned silver too, her hands thinner, but still warm in his. "Do you ever think of the war?" she asked softly. "Only when I hear silence," he answered. "It reminds me of how loud it once was." She smiled faintly, tracing the edge of his hand. "And now?" Carl looked out at the fields where tractors hummed gently in the distance. "Now," he said, "I think we finally built something that lasts." The world outside glowed in quiet harmony. No fire, no ruins, only the endless rhythm of the living. Later that week, Carl received a letter sealed in blue wax. It was from America, from Mallory. Inside was a photograph. A museum in Washington with a Sherman tank restored to glory, its plaque reading, "Dedicated to those who built to endure." Carl stared at it for a long time, the corners trembling in his aging hands. He turned it over, finding a note scrawled in Mallory's rough handwriting. "Thought you'd like to see an old friend still standing." Carl smiled through tears. "Still standing," he whispered. Clara found him there and rested her head on his shoulder. For both of them, the war had finally ended, not with silence, but with remembrance. That autumn, the fields turned to amber again, and Carl walked slower now. The young men who worked the machines waved as he passed, calling greetings in voices full of life. He smiled and nodded, each gesture a benediction. At the edge of the yard, he stopped before the old Sherman frame, overgrown with ivy, half sunk in the soil. He rested his palm on the cold steel, the same way he had decades before. "Thank you," he whispered, "for teaching me to build for peace." The wind rose gently, rustling the leaves around the tank, as if the machine itself answered in kind. When winter came, Carl passed quietly in his sleep, a faint smile on his lips. Beside his bed lay his old notebook. Its pages yellowed, the final sketch a simple outline of two gears interlocking, captioned in shaky handwriting. "Strength is the mercy of design." The funeral was small. Clara placed his wrench atop the coffin, the same one he'd used to dismantle the Sherman. Years later, villagers would speak of him not as the engineer who built machines of war, but as the man who taught them to build things that lasted. And in the workshop where he once worked, the light still fell through the roof the same way it always had, as if the sun itself remembered him.